The monitor above my grandfather's hospital bed glowed a sickly green, each beep a thin, stubborn heartbeat, fighting the quiet. The room smelled like antiseptic and overcooked coffee, the kind you only get in hospital hallways at 3 a.m. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, turning his skin the color of paper. I stood on one side of the bed, my fingers wrapped around the cool metal rail, while my sister stood on the other, mascara streaked down her cheeks, clutching the blanket like it was a lifeline. "Grandpa," she whispered, leaning in so close her hair brushed the pillow. "I'm sorry. I took what wasn't mine." His eyes fluttered cloudy but searching, moving from her face to mine. For a heartbeat, everything else disappeared, the hiss of oxygen, the shuffle of nurses outside, even the ache in my chest. All I saw was the man who'd built an empire with those now trembling hands lying there, listening to his favorite granddaughter admit she'd robbed him blind. "What did you say?" His voice rasped, barely louder than the machine's. Brianna's shoulders shook. "It was me," she choked out. "Tyler and we used your money. The safe. I thought I'd pay it back. I swear I did." Something in his expression shifted. Not shock. He was too tired for that, but a deep bone-level sorrow like the foundation of our family had finally cracked in a way it would never recover from. I felt my nails dig into the metal rail as I watched him, my throat tight, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. Our eyes met. "You knew," he breathed. I swallowed the air in the room, suddenly too thick. "Yes," I said, "I knew." The corner of his mouth lifted in the faintest hint of a smile, more shadow than expression. "And you chose justice. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you." My name is Lena Ward, and until that moment in the hospital, I thought I understood what loyalty meant. I grew up in a house where the floors were marble, the walls were covered in oil paintings, and the pantry was never empty. People called my grandfather legendary in business magazines, but to me, he was just Grandpa Henry, the man who taught me how to balance a checkbook before I could drive, who made me earn my first car by interning at his company instead of handing me the keys. My parents were gone before I hit high school, divorced, remarried, and busy in other states, so most of my childhood revolved around that big Arizona estate and the man who lived in it. Grandpa handled feelings the way he handled money, quietly and with spreadsheets. Birthdays meant envelopes with savings bonds and a handwritten note about compound interest. Hugs were rare, but his presence was steady, and for a kid who watched her family split into separate Christmases, that steadiness felt like love. Brianna saw things differently. She was 2 years older, prettier in that polished magazine cover way, and she learned early that charm could get her what discipline never did. Where I stayed late at the office during summer breaks, learning how the accounting software worked, she floated in and out of the house with new boyfriends, new handbags, and new grudges about who deserved what. "You're his little protege," she'd say, whenever Grandpa took me to a board meeting or asked for my opinion on a property deal. "I'm just the spare." I tried to tell her it wasn't like that he'd have taken her too if she'd shown the slightest interest in anything other than being comfortable. But resentment has a way of rewriting history. In her version, I was the favorite, she was the overlooked one, and Grandpa's fortune was a kind of moral debt the universe owed her. By the time I was 30, I was working as a financial analyst at one of Grandpa's smaller companies, living in a modest condo instead of the mansion, and visiting him most mornings before heading into the office. That's what I was doing the day everything changed. I walked into his study carrying his favorite coffee black 1 sugar and froze. The safe, the old steel one set into the paneled wall behind his desk, was standing open. The door hung at an angle like a broken jaw. The velvet-lined drawers inside were empty, their contents ripped away so fast one of the small pouches had torn at the seam and been left behind. The air in the room felt wrong thinner, like someone had stolen not just money, but oxygen. "Grandpa!" My voice sounded too loud in the echo of that big room. He shuffled in a moment later in his robe and slippers, his cane tapping across the hardwood. When he saw the open safe, the color drained from his face. He reached for the door with a shaking hand, then stopped halfway, fingers hovering over the cold metal. "No," he whispered. "Lena, It was locked last night. I checked it myself. I knelt in front of the safe, my mind already cataloging what should have been their cash reserves, rare coins. Grandma Evelyn's sapphire necklace. Some old documents he'd never fully explained. There were no scratches around the dial, no bent hinges, no sign that anyone had forced their way in. "Who knows the combination?" I asked quietly. He stared at me, eyes clouded with confusion, and something that looked a lot like fear. "Just you and me," he said. "That's it." The police came, took pictures, dusted for prints, and left us with a report full of boxes and blank lines. Insurance sent an adjuster who frowned at the lack of forced entry and hinted that fraud was always a concern. By late afternoon, the study felt less like a sanctuary and more like a crime scene no one cared enough to solve. They took everything Grandpa said, sinking into his leather chair, rubbing his temples with the heel of his hand. Years of work. Gone. I put a hand on his shoulder, but inside something colder was moving. A question. A suspicion so ugly I didn't want to look at it directly. My phone buzzed on the desk. Absent-mindedly, I picked it up. There on the screen, glowing in a neat little square, was my sister's face. Brianna, standing in front of a gleaming silver SUV, champagne in one hand, keys in the other. The caption read, "New chapter, new ride," followed by a trail of heart and sparkle emojis. I swallowed my thumb, hovering over the screen, as I swiped to the next photo, a sleek, open-concept kitchen with marble countertops and brass fixtures, a just-closed sign leaning against the island, and Tyler grinning like he'd won the lottery. The timestamp on the post, 2 days after the night the safe had been opened. Behind me, Grandpa exhaled long and tired. "Maybe we just move on," he murmured. I stared at Brianna's smiling face, at the granite, the car, the glittering glass of champagne. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the favorite or the overlooked one. I felt like the only person in the family who could see what was right in front of us. I locked my phone, slid it back onto the desk, and forced my voice to stay steady. "We'll figure it out," I told him. But as the sun slipped down behind the desert hills and the house settled into uneasy silence, I knew one thing with terrifying clarity: someone close had emptied that safe. And if my sister thought she could toast new beginnings on the ashes of my grandfather's life's work, she had no idea who she'd just pushed to the edge. The backyard lights were already glowing when I stepped outside, clutching a plastic bowl of potato salad I'd spent the whole afternoon making. Laughter floated from the long picnic table by the pool, silverware clinking chairs scraping across the patio. My grandfather sat at the head, my sister beside him, her dress shimmering in the warm Arizona dusk. Someone had set out name cards, little folded tents of cardstock with tidy handwriting. As I walked closer, I noticed mine wasn't there. Every place was filled, every seat taken. Brianna glanced at me over her shoulder, then leaned in and whispered something to the cousin beside her, who laughed in that sharp, cutting way that wasn't really laughter at all. No one made room. No one offered to shift a chair. Grandpa lifted his glass to make a toast, his smile soft, unaware. I was standing there on the concrete with a bowl in my hands and nowhere to go. I stayed frozen until the toast ended, then stepped back into the shadows, the sound of their celebration rising behind me like applause for my absence. The bowl grew heavy in my arms. When a breeze swept across the yard, it chilled the sweat on my skin, and for a moment I felt like I was 11 years old again, present, but invisible. Years later, I would still remember the sting of that night, the smell of grilled chicken, the glow of lanterns swaying from the pergola, Brianna's bright smile, the way she slid so seamlessly into spaces that never opened for me. I didn't say a word back then, and I didn't drop the bowl or cry or ask why there was no seat for me. I simply walked inside and ate alone at the kitchen island. Funny how a small moment can echo across a lifetime. The memory flickered away as easily as it had surfaced, leaving me sitting in Grandpa's quiet study, the faint scent of old leather and dust settling back around me. Some moments don't leave you. They wait. Mistreatment in our family rarely arrived with raised voices or slammed doors. It came in subtle choices, small omissions, and the way people learned to step around me, as if my presence were optional. I didn't grow up believing I was unwanted, not exactly. It was more that I always seemed to be the extra piece in a puzzle completed without me. When Brianna and I were children, the divide was already visible, though no one admitted it. She was the bright one, the one who drew people in with her smile and easy charm. She fit perfectly into every social circle, every conversation, every birthday photo. I, on the other hand, was the girl who lingered at the edges, quiet, dependable, careful with my words. Our parents divorced when I was still in middle school. My father remarried quickly. My mother drifted into a life that didn't include regular phone calls, and Brianna filled her loneliness with attention wherever she could find it. I didn't resent her for that. In some twisted way, I envied her. Grandpa stepped in for both of us, but even with him there were differences, though he never intended them. He'd invite me into his office to help sort documents, asking my opinion on small decisions to make me think. He'd send me math puzzles, articles on budgeting, or stories about entrepreneurs who started with nothing but grit. For Brianna, he bought dresses, tickets to concerts, trips to San Diego with her friends. He didn't see it as favoritism. He saw it as giving us what we each needed. But children don't interpret fairness like adults do. They don't understand nuance or intentions. They understand what they receive, how they're seen, where they are placed. And I was always placed second. I remember one Christmas particularly well. Brianna got a camcorder sleek expensive, the kind teenagers in the early 2000s dreamed of owning. I unwrapped a calculator, a high-end financial one, the kind used in college courses. Grandpa smiled proudly as he explained every function. "You'll appreciate this one day. It's practical. Useful." He wasn't wrong, but the room fell into a strange hush. Brianna tried to hide her grin, failing. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, embarrassment blooming into something that tasted bitter. Later that night, I heard my aunt whisper to my mother, "It's like he's grooming her to run his company." My mother sighed. "Maybe he thinks Brianna won't need to work." It took years to understand the weight of those words. At school, the dynamic followed me. Teachers praised my diligence, but the other kids gravitated toward Brianna. She was the girl you noticed always laughing, always surrounded, always certain of her place in a room. I learned not to expect invitations, not to expect anyone to save me a seat at lunch or hand me a piece of gum during class or ask if I wanted to walk home together. By the time we were adults, the pattern had hardened. Brianna saw the world as a place that owed her softness. I saw it as a place that rewarded preparation. But here's the thing about growing up as the solitary one. Silence becomes your survival skill. You learn to stay quiet to avoid conflict, to adapt your expectations, to make yourself small so you don't become a burden. I didn't realize how deeply that habit had sunk into my bones until the day I saw the safe open. Standing in that study, looking at the empty drawers and torn velvet pouch, something old stirred in me. A memory of every time I was told to calm down, be reasonable, give people the benefit of the doubt. Every time I'd watched Brianna slip through life with ease while consequences slid off her like water. Every time I'd eaten alone, stood alone, been forgotten, overlooked, or made to feel like asking for my place at the table was asking too much. It wasn't simply the theft that hurt. It was the realization that Brianna still operated under the belief that she was entitled to whatever she wanted and that the world, even our world, would keep forgiving her. Grandpa's devastation only deepened the wound. Watching his shoulders slump, hearing the tremor in his voice, feeling the helplessness radiate from him like heat. Those moments cracked something in me. I'd spent my entire life trying to stay invisible so no one would accuse me of wanting too much. But now the cost of staying quiet was sitting right in front of me, an old man robbed by someone he loved, too loyal to suspect the truth, too tired to fight for it, even if he knew. For days, as I drove to and from the mansion, I felt that old childhood ache pulsing beneath everything like a bruise pressed by unseen fingers. But now there was something else layered on top, a whisper I had spent my entire life training myself not to hear. "You deserve better." It was strange, almost startling. My mind kept digging up memories, not because I wanted them, but because they wouldn't stay buried anymore. Holidays where I played hostess while Brianna played celebrity. Times she'd borrow money from Grandpa but never pay it back. Moments she'd brag about being the favorite while I stood in the doorway pretending not to mind. Family imbalances don't happen overnight. They grow from small, consistent choices. And ours had grown for decades. One afternoon, a few days after the theft, I found myself sitting in my condo with the blinds half drawn against the bright Arizona sun. I had a pile of documents on the table, bank statements I'd requested from the accounts I managed at work, a notepad filled with dates and numbers, a timeline I'd begun assembling without even telling myself that's what I was doing. But it wasn't the papers that caught my eye. It was a photograph clipped to the edge of one of the folders. Brianna at 15, smiling with a kind of youthful confidence that still made me ache. I was beside her smiling too, but mine was a smaller, more careful smile, the kind you give when you're not sure if you belong in the picture. Looking at that photo, I felt something settle deep in my stomach. This wasn't new. This wasn't random. This wasn't a moment of weakness from her. It was a pattern that had grown unchecked for too long. A quiet agreement the whole family had made. Lena endures. Brianna receives. And that's when I knew the story of the safe wasn't just about money or property or a necklace that belonged to our grandmother. It was the final chapter in a long book I'd been pretending not to read. The injustice had roots not in the crime itself, but in the years that made it possible. Late that night, after the desert wind cooled the air enough for me to open the windows, I sat at my kitchen table and let the breeze move through the room. I closed my eyes and breathed in the quiet, because quiet was the one thing I'd always been allowed to keep. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't compliance, or fear, or resignation. It felt like the space before a door opens. A soft knock would come the next morning, one that would pull everything into focus. And when it did, the truths I'd been piecing together would finally begin to align in a way I could no longer ignore. The thick manila envelope slid halfway out of the mailbox, its corner bent from being jammed in too tightly. I didn't think anything of it, not until I noticed my sister's name typed neatly across the label, followed by her new address in Desert Ridge. A mistake, I thought at first. Wrong delivery. But when I pulled it free, the flap popped open just enough for a stack of documents to fan out bank statements crisp and recent, one of them showing a deposit so large it stole the breath from my lungs. $25,000 in cash posted the day after Grandpa's safe was emptied. Another document slipped loose, fluttering onto my front step, a mortgage application with Brianna's signature at the bottom, the ink still bold. Attached was a receipt for a massive down payment paid in there. It was again cash. My hands trembled, the desert heat rising around me like a wave. Then deeper in the pile, a dealership invoice with the same date range stared up at me. An Audi delivered a down payment cleared. Paid by my sister. Paid in cash she never had. I sank onto my porch step, papers scattered around me, like shards of a secret someone thought would stay buried. The street was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of someone's AC kicking on. But inside my chest something was pounding hard, fast, certain. It took several breaths before I remembered to look around, collect everything, and drag it all inside before the wind carried away the truth. For a long moment I just stood there in the entryway clutching those papers like they were burning. And in a sense, they were. The shock didn't fade quickly. It settled slowly like dust after a collapse, and with each heartbeat, I understood a little more about what those documents meant and what they didn't need to explain. I laid the pages out across my kitchen table. Sunlight from the window fell across them in a harsh stripe, emphasizing every number, every signature, every timestamp that lined up far too precisely to be coincidence. For days after the theft, I had been grasping at suspicions, arranging little hints into a picture no one wanted me to see. But suspicion is fog. These papers were brick and steel. The first bank statement set the tone, an unreported cash deposit so large it would have triggered an automatic review. The second statement showed another deposit 3 days later, nearly the same amount split just enough to duck under the regulations. It was amateurish, sloppy, reckless. And it spoke to desperation mixed with arrogance, the kind that makes people believe rules are meant for other people. Brianna's name was on everything: the mortgage application, the home inspection receipt, the down payment documentation. Tyler's signature appeared on some too, but hers was everywhere. It leapt off the page, mocking me with its loops and flourishes. I stared at her handwriting for a long time, remembering how she used to practice different styles when we were teenagers. Curly letters, angular ones, tall, elegant strokes. She used to say your handwriting was your identity, the way the world understood you. And now that same handwriting was pointing at a betrayal deep enough to hollow out the ground beneath our family. The numbers lined up so simply it astonished me that no one else had questioned them, but then again, no one else had looked. Grandpa wouldn't. He trusted us too fully. The police barely scratched the surface. The insurance company only cared about forced entry. Everyone had been waiting for lies to reveal themselves in dramatic fashion. But lies rarely do that. They reveal themselves in the margins in tiny codes, in unguarded dates, in bank statements addressed to the wrong house on the wrong day. And suddenly, everything from the last few years began falling into place. The way Brianna always seemed to have a new handbag despite claiming money was tight. The sudden vacations she and Tyler took despite his job barely covering their rent. The late-night calls to Grandpa asking for small favors that were never paid back. The subtle shift in her tone whenever the conversation turned to inheritance or assets or how Grandpa should enjoy his life more. She'd been circling his resources for years, finding little ways to dip into his generosity. And he wanting so badly to see the good in us let her. I had told myself not to assume the worst of my own sister. But assumptions weren't needed anymore. The truth was printed right in front of me in ink that didn't smudge no matter how many times I ran my thumb across it. The more I read, the angrier I became. Not the fiery, explosive anger of someone betrayed by surprise, but a slow, deliberate anger that seeped up from the deepest parts of my memory. Every time she'd laughed off responsibility. Every moment she'd brushed off consequences. Every time someone had made an excuse for her because she was still figuring things out. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a pattern in its final ugly form. Even worse was the realization of how long she must have been planning this. To get the safe combination. To know Grandpa wouldn't suspect her. To believe she could take what she wanted, build a new life with it, and smile in photos as if nothing had happened. It made my stomach twist. I thought back to this night after the theft when I'd walked past Grandpa's room and heard his soft cough. How I'd paused outside his door, one hand on the frame, torn between telling him and protecting him. He'd sounded so small, so tired. If he had seen these documents, if he'd known his own granddaughter had used his trust as a wedge to pry open his life savings, I wasn't sure he would have survived the shock. That was when the anger hardened into something else. Something sharper. Resolve. I gathered the papers into a single stack, aligning the edges carefully, not out of neatness, but out of something close to reverence. These weren't just financial records. They were proof. Proof of who had hurt him. Proof of what she'd taken. Proof that the quiet child in the corner had finally seen enough to open her mouth. The decision didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It arrived like sunrise, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. For most of my life, I'd accepted that being overlooked was safer than being noticed, that silence kept the peace, that endurance was easier than confrontation. But looking at the papers, I realized something simple but profound: silence had protected the wrong person. Every year I'd swallowed injustices, thinking they were small enough to ignore, had built toward this moment. Every time I'd let Brianna take advantage of Grandpa's softness, had paved the road to this doorstep, this envelope, these documents. Every wound from childhood had been pointing me directly to this truth. If I didn't act now, she would do worse. She would keep taking, keep lying, keep feeding off the man who had held our family together through every storm. I leaned back in my chair, the late afternoon sun sliding lower across the floor, stretching shadows over the table. I rested my hand on the top page as if steadying both the documents and the part of myself that was shaking. There was no going back now. Not from this. I picked up my phone. Not to call Brianna, she would twist, deny, deflect. Not to call Grandpa, he didn't deserve this heartbreak, until I had something solid in place. I called someone else. Someone who had known me long enough to trust my instincts and who had no stake in protecting my family's illusions. Someone who understood the language of numbers and patterns better than most people understood words. When he answered on the second ring, I didn't bother to exchange pleasantries. "I need help," I said. "Financial help. Quiet help." There was a pause. Then a steady voice replied, "Tell me everything." I did, all while running my fingertips along the edge of the paper stack like it was a fuse waiting for a spark. By the time I hung up, the direction of my life and hers had already begun to shift. The girl who once walked away from crowded tables without making a sound had just decided to pull out a chair and flip it over. And in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my sister's betrayal, I whispered the first full truth I'd allowed myself to speak in years. I'm done being silent. Tomorrow I would act. Tomorrow I would confront. Tomorrow I would expose exactly what had been hidden. The dining room went silent the moment I stood up. Forks hovered midair. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every pair of eyes followed the sound of the thick navy blue folder hitting the table with a heavy, unmistakable thud. Brianna froze across from me, her wineglass tilted just enough that a single drop slid down the rim and splashed onto the white tablecloth. I reached inside the folder without breaking eye contact and laid down the first page, one of the bank statements addressed to her new house, the numbers bold under the chandelier's light. "What is this?" Grandpa asked, his voice thin but steady. I didn't answer him. I turned the page. Another deposit. Another cash amount. Another date that lined up with the week his safe had been emptied. Whispering rippled around the table. Tyler pushed back in his chair as if preparing to run. Then I placed the final sheet down, the one with Brianna's signature. Mortgage down payment, both in cash. The room seemed to shrink around us as I said, "She didn't just steal the money. She used my name to access one of Grandpa's accounts." The gasp that followed was sharp enough to split the room in half. And that's where everything truly cracked open. Moments like that don't arrive fully formed. They build, they press, they simmer behind your ribs until the truth becomes too heavy to contain. Let me take you back to how the pressure finally met the match. I had known from the moment I found those documents that this wouldn't end quietly. Brianna thrived in shadows, private excuses, whispered stories, pretty lies told behind closed doors. If I confronted her in private, she'd twist it. If I confronted her one-on-one, she'd cry until I looked like the villain. I needed a room, a witness, a moment she couldn't slither out of. Grandpa's Sunday dinner became the perfect setting. He insisted on hosting even though fatigue drew lines under his eyes. "A family meal will do us good," he'd murmured, unaware of the storm he was placing a tablecloth over. I didn't want to hurt him, but the truth had already hurt him more than any reveal ever could. So I prepared, calmly, methodically. I printed every document, highlighted nothing truth didn't need markers. I placed everything in that Navy folder because it was the kind Grandpa had used for decades, the kind authority seemed to cling to. And when Sunday came, I walked into that dining room knowing there was no turning back. Dinner started politely enough, roast chicken, fresh rolls, too much small talk filling the space where trust used to live. Grandpa asked Tyler about work, and Tyler lied with the ease of someone who'd practiced. Brianna chimed in with a brittle smile, pretending everything was fine. Everyone played their parts. But I watched her hands. She kept smoothing the tablecloth in front of her, flattening invisible wrinkles. Her tells hadn't changed since childhood. Nervous hands meant she sensed the ground shifting. I waited until the plates were cleared, until the wine glasses were topped off, until every chair scraped back into place. There's a moment right before truth drops, when the air grows thick, as if the room itself is bracing. That's when I stood. And the room broke. Now, as the shock settled over the table, I felt the weight of years lifting from my chest. Lena Grandpa said, "Gently, explain." I inhaled slowly, gathering the room into focus. "This is the money that went missing from your safe," I said. "The deposits are hers. The timing matches exactly. But that's not all." Brianna shot up, palms flat on the table. "You're twisting things. I never stole anything. Tyler, tell them." But Tyler was staring at the documents with a ghost-white face. He swallowed hard. "Bree, you said—" "Don't," she snapped. The crack in her tone was all I needed. "Here's the real twist," I said quietly. "The new house you bought, the down payment wasn't made from your account." I held up another sheet. It was made from an account under my name. Chairs creaked. Someone gasped. Grandpa's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" I slid the paper toward him, an authorization form with my printed name, my social security number, and a signature that wasn't mine. "She forged my signature," I said. "She used my identity to authorize the withdrawal. My credit was hit. My name was flagged. She didn't just steal from you, Grandpa." My voice shook with a mixture of fury and clarity. "She stole from me." The room erupted. Grandpa pushed himself up slowly, gripping the table with both hands. His face had gone ashen, the heartbreak visible in the way his shoulders slumped. "Brianna, tell me this isn't true." She took a step back, then another. I didn't know Tyler would—" Tyler's head snapped toward her. "Don't you dare put this on me. You brought the code. You asked for the forms. You said he'd never notice." Her expression flickered between panic and rage. "You're unbelievable," she hissed. "You promised you'd sort the money before anyone saw it, so you admit it," I said. Silence, dense and suffocating, fell. She had incriminated herself without even realizing it. Tyler shoved away from the table. "I'm not going down for this. You planned the whole thing, don't pretend you didn't." Grandpa's hand trembled as he lifted the forged signature page. How could you do this? To your sister, to me?" Brianna looked around wildly, searching for a lifeline. Things were hard. We needed a break. You've always had everything, Lena. Everyone listens to you. Everyone trusts you." Her voice rose sharp with resentment, years in the making. "And me?" she cried. "No one took me seriously. Not once. Not in this family." Her confession wasn't triumphant. It was desperate, ugly, raw, and no one reached out to comfort her. Something in the room tilted then. You could feel it, the collective shift. The understanding that whatever sympathy Brianna once commanded had been replaced by disbelief and disappointment. I stepped closer, not towering, not cruel, just steady in a way I'd never been allowed to be. "Needing help isn't wrong," I said, voice low, "but stealing, lying, using my name to cover your tracks, that's not family, that's betrayal." She shook her head frantically, her eyes red. "You set this up. You wanted to humiliate me." "No," I replied. "You did this all on your own. I'm just done shielding you from consequences." Grandpa sank back into his chair, the documents trembling in his hands. "For years," he whispered, "I tried to teach you integrity, to give you both a future. I never imagined," his voice cracked, "forging your sister's name." Brianna's sob broke open, but no one moved to console her, not even Tyler. The fallout was immediate. Tyler denied wanting anything to do with her after this. The relatives around the table whispered among themselves, their glances sharp as knives. The room that had once leaned toward her now recoiled. And for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I simply gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder with slow precision, and tucked it under my arm. "I'm leaving now," I said, looking at no one and everyone all at once. I didn't come here to destroy her. I came to stop her from destroying us. As I walked toward the doorway, the room remained suspended in stunned silence. Just before I stepped out, I heard Grandpa whisper my name, soft, weary, proud. Behind me, Brianna started crying again, but her voice sounded different now, thin, unraveling, as if all the lies she'd woven had finally come loose in her hands. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. The door clicked shut behind me with a kind of finality I felt all the way down to my ribs. The house was still humming with voices, whispers, shock, the brittle sound of a family grappling with a truth they had never imagined, but out on the porch, everything was quiet. The Arizona sunset was thinning into dusk streaks of gold, dissolving into violet as the desert wind brushed against my face. I stood there for a moment, letting the air settle around me, realizing that for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to make anyone else comfortable. I wasn't carrying someone else's excuses. I wasn't apologizing for what I knew. Something had shifted, not just in the room I'd walked out of, but in me. I walked to my car with steady steps, feeling lighter, with each one lighter in a way that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with reclaiming space inside my own life. Later that night, after the shock of the confrontation had faded into a strange, quiet calm, I drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let the desert air carry me forward. That dinner had closed one chapter brutally, but it opened another that was long overdue. The next morning was clear and bright, the sky an enormous stretch of blue that seemed almost too generous. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and spread the documents out again this time, not as evidence, but as a map of what I needed to reclaim. My grandfather had always taught me that dignity is not something you negotiate for. It's something you preserve by choosing yourself when no one else will. So I began the slow, deliberate process of putting things back in order. First came the financial cleanup, the paperwork to correct the forged authorization, the filings to protect my credit, the confirmation that the funds were returned to Grandpa's estate. His attorney handled much of it, but he looked at me one afternoon over his glasses and said, "Your decisiveness is what saved this from spiraling." It wasn't praise I needed, but it was validation that steadied me. I visited the mansion often during those weeks, not out of obligation, but because Grandpa asked me to. He was weaker than before, but his mind was still sharp, and the trust between us had taken on a new, quieter strength. One afternoon, he motioned for me to sit beside him by the library window. Sunlight stretched across the room, touching the spines of books he'd collected over a lifetime. "Lena," he said softly, "a family can lose money and still recover. But when integrity is stolen rebuilding, it takes a steadier hand. You were that hand." His words settled into me like warm clay, shaping something steady and grounded inside my chest. After he passed a few months later, the reading of his will held no surprises. Everything he had built, the businesses, the home, the accounts, came to me. Not because I was the favorite, but because I had been the one who honored the values that built it. There was nothing triumphant in it. It simply felt right, like restoring something to where it had always been meant to stand. The mansion was too large for one person, so I chose to keep only the smaller guest house on the property, a single-story adobe-style home tucked behind a line of citrus trees. I spent weeks cleaning it out, repainting the walls, soft, warm colors replacing old fixtures Grandpa never had the heart to update. Physical work has a way of restoring emotional balance, and every stroke of the brush, every cabinet I repaired, felt like clearing a path inside myself. As for Brianna, our contact became quiet and infrequent. She tried once or twice to call to explain again, to blame circumstance or fear or pressure, but I had learned the cost of letting her narrative override reality. I kept my answers brief, polite, boundaried. That was the cleanest way to preserve peace, by not offering her any corners to escape accountability. She wasn't a villain I needed to punish. She was a storm I no longer needed to stand under. In the midst of all that rebuilding, kindness found me in unexpected ways. A neighbor from down the road brought over a homemade casserole the week after the funeral, leaving it on my porch with a note that simply said, "Thinking of you." One of my co-workers invited me to a small dinner with her family, insisting I shouldn't be alone during difficult months. Even the clerk at the local hardware store remembered my name after my 5th visit in 1 week, asking how the renovation was coming along with a smile that didn't feel forced. Those small moments, simple everyday gestures, stitched together a sort of found family I didn't realize I'd needed. People who weren't connected to me by blood, but by decency. By the start of the summer, the guest house felt like a new chapter. Bright, warm, intentional. I planted 2 saplings in the backyard, right near the wall of grapefruit trees Grandpa had once tended himself. As I pressed the soil around the roots, I felt something inside me settle. Planting something, especially in the desert, is an act of faith. A promise that what grows next will be nurtured, not taken. After everything that had happened, I didn't crave revenge or retribution. I craved clarity. And I finally had it. One evening near the end of the renovation, I opened all the windows of the house. The breeze moved through the rooms with a soft, steady rhythm, lifting the curtains just enough to make them sway like breath. I stood in the middle of the living room, hands on my hips, taking in the space, the fresh paint, the warm light, the quiet. This wasn't the home I inherited. It was the home I shaped from what remained. And in that moment, I understood something simple and profound. Healing is less about forgetting what broke you and more about building a life where that kind of breaking has no place anymore. We don't rise by winning battles over others. We rise by choosing peace over chaos, clarity over delusion, and dignity over approval. As the last of the daylight faded and the desert settled into its familiar hush, I whispered a small thank you to the man who had taught me those values long before I knew how much I'd need them. Grandfather's legacy was never the wealth he left behind. It was the steadiness he built into me, the kind that helps a person weather storms and then rebuild with purpose. And as I closed the windows one by one, feeling the calm gather around me like a soft mantle, I realized something I hadn't quite been able to say until then. Some endings don't break us. They free us to become who we were always meant to be.